only on Discovery and HD.
Well, the latest news on the Algerian hostage crisis, as we've been hearing, is that the Algerian government are now saying that more than half of the 132 foreign hostages are safe. That, of course, apparently leaves questions about the fate of around 60 to 70 of them. I'm joined now by Raffaello Pantucci, who is an expert on al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb at the Royal United Services Institute, Nick Butler, former head of strategy at BP, and Nabila Ramdani is a Franco-Algerian journalist. Nick Butler, before we go any further, just tell us a little bit about this place. I mean, how many people working there? How remote is it?
Several hundred people working there. It is way out in the desert in Algeria, south of Algiers. It is producing gas and putting it into the pipeline that takes it to the liquefying facility on the coast, which brings it to the world market. It's protected, but I think because circumstances in Algeria over the last 10 years have been quite relaxed, in contrast to the 1990s, the level of security was not that of an armed camp. It was normal security for a sensitive facility, and obviously not enough to counteract a very determined group, which is what this looks like.
Now, we understand BP have already had 3 flights out of personnel, but I suppose people will say, well, once the hostilities flared up in Mali, there should have perhaps been greater protection.
Well, I think the main concern in the companies now, BP and Statoil, is what has happened to their people. I mean, these big companies, they look remote and insensitive from a distance, but inside their families, and an awful lot of people in the UK and Norway and their offices will know individuals there. So that's their top concern. The next concern is what to do with the remaining staff in Algeria, both international staff and locals, and how many, if any, to evacuate.
Thank you. Well, we're just hearing some more from Algerian state news agencies that they say in total 650 hostages have now been freed, of which 573 were Algerians, local workers. So by my quick maths, that means that that's 47 foreign hostages freed, which doesn't, to me, quite seem to square with more than half of 132. But, I mean, you've been talking to the government and to other sources in Algeria. It's still a very confused situation.
Yes, very much so. But what they are quite prompt to highlight is to justify their robust approach to this very serious crisis. And they have been telling me that they've acted in a very pragmatic manner. We are dealing with the largest gas plant in Algeria. It represents a huge proportion of the GDP. This is clearly vital to the Algerian economy. And they're arguing essentially that there was no possibility for them to let this facility to become overrun by al-Qaeda. And they also prompt to say that negotiations would have been possible had the attack happened somewhere else on an isolated compound, as was the case in 2003 when Mokhtar Ben Mokhtar, who was also involved in the kidnapping of 32 European nationals, was effectively negotiated the release of all of them over a period of 6 months. But clearly the economic matter here is really at the heart of all.
It must just make a quick correction. We understand that 77 of the 132 foreign hostages are now free, so that leaves something in the region of 50 still unaccounted for. Mm-hmm. What about it's very clear that it's not a direct criticism, but I think the implications of what we've heard from the British government so far is, first of all, that they haven't been consulted on what's been going on, and secondly, that perhaps the Algerian forces were a bit trigger-happy.
Well, I think one has to bear in mind the very violent history of the country, which dates back to the 1950s, effectively, where the Algerians fought in a very savage war against the French in the War of Independence, ending up with more than 1 million people being killed, and the very somber 1990s, where Islamic militant groups were fighting the Algerian military and the government, which ended up with 250,000 people dying at least over a decade. So this has produced one of the most ruthless security forces in North Africa, which are ready to respond in kind, if I may put it that way, to equally nasty elements like Al-Qaeda-inspired groups.
Raffaele Pantucci, do you see this as a particularly bold incident or as part of a pattern now in that part of Africa, North Africa?
Well, over the past year, we've seen instability in groups like this one that specifically carried out this attack have become more audacious and continued to sort of, they've drawn a lot of strength from the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, specifically in Libya, which sort of opened up the armories, and it also provided a lot of their fighters with training. These fighters trained and fought there and then sort of filtered back to their countries. In Mali, we saw a particular groups sort of manage to align and take over large pieces of territory. But other networks, like this particular one, which is a sort of splinter of AQIM, have managed to sort of rebuild themselves out of this and conduct operations like this one.
I mean, there was a lengthy civil war more recently in Algeria involving Islamists. I mean, is Algeria sort of vulnerable to falling in the direction that perhaps we saw Somalia fall earlier on, or Mali?
I don't think so. I mean, I think Nabila pointed out quite correctly how the Algerian forces have really had to deal with this problem for a long time and have frankly quite effectively managed to contain it. Up until, I would say, about over a year ago, AQIM, the sort of original root group of which this is a sort of splinter, had been largely pushed up into the mountains and was really not really able to conduct many operations. So I think it would be far too early to say that this is a prelude to some sort of state collapse or anything of the sort.
Nabila is saying how important this installation is to Algeria. I mean, how vital is it to BP, to put it frankly?
It's important, but it's not something that's going to really change the fortunes of the company. So far, we haven't seen production really interrupted, and there's been very little effect on international prices. The risk, and I think this comes out of what happened yesterday, is that the very rough response of the military in Algeria could lead to more reprisals and to a new conflict. And then I think BP and the others will have to reconsider the risk-return judgment that they're making on investing there.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Coming up, how Lance Armstrong finally came clean.